You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I'm here tonight with Francis Etheredge. We've had many interviews so far, and I'm looking forward to another good one. So tonight we're starting a trilogy called From Truth to Truth, and it's Volume 1 that we're going to talk about, and that's Faithful Reason. How are you, Francis?
Very well, thank you. Shall we begin with a prayer?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I'll invoke the seat of wisdom, Mary, seat of wisdom. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen.
Right, well, Faithful Reason has a starting point, in a way, in the very term reason, because it can appear to be a disembodied faculty, the fact that we think. And I was even looking up the statue by Rodin of the thinker, who's sitting with his forehead on his fist and pondering. In one sense, that makes sense, that a person should pause and ponder and think. But in another way, owing to the research on the word reason, it's too abstract. And what the research turned up was that the very term reason has to do with handling what we think through that is in our hands. And I think this sense of the engagement of our hands brings more to the fore the whole person who is thinking and the engagement with something. So, for example, one of the characteristics of the universe, indeed the world in which we live, is its very capacity to go from what we would call in scriptural language the literal to the spiritual sense. So, for example, I can be pulling up weeds and digging in the soil and planting something, and it's very easy to go from those activities as literally what I'm doing to considering, well, in what way does a weed stand for something like a vice or an undesirable characteristic that I want to be rid of? And so the sense of engagement through our reason not only speaks of an involvement of the whole person, who is doing the thinking, who is turning over the soil, who is planting or weeding, but it also, in a way, picks up on the fact that the universe has this characteristic, that in its very relationship to me and to others, it's incredibly capable of being turned not just literally through our fingers as we consider what soil is and whether it's dry or moist and whether we're going to water it or not, but actually in its characteristic of being able to be turned into imagery that expresses ourselves. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, that there is a very real relationship. And I do wonder if this is another way of arguing that there must be a creator, one who brought to exist not just me or not just it in the sense of the universe, but the very fact that we are in this relationship. So whether it's fire and its well-known biblical relationship to expressing the Holy Spirit, or in terms of ancient philosophy, it being one of the characteristics of matter to be expressed in terms of what changes. That this wholesomeness, this capacity for us to not just dialogue with ourselves, but with what exists, is kind of enfolded or embraced in what reality is like, as well as how it brings us out of ourselves in order to know it. And so this starting point then is very much about being engaged with how we actually are, rather than a more disembodied sense of what it is to reason. Now, certainly there are chains of reason. And from that point of view, we can go off in different directions. But I think the point of starting with the very vivid sense of what goes through our hands is much more about bringing to the fore everything that characterizes us and everything that characterizes the world in which we live. And so, even from the point of view of being tired, it is often much more difficult to think when we're tired, or conversely when we're excited, and our thoughts accelerate. This sense of the whole person being expressed. And then also, there's a tendency for us to refer to the senses as if in some way the senses are detached from us. They're not an intrinsic part of how reason functions. But if I think about the sensitivity of a sculptor, who has his chisel in his hand, or the lover, the person whose touch is touching another person, or the musician whose sensitivity is expressed in the modulations of a string or touching the notes of a piano. There isn't the same sense of the senses being separate to the person, as if they're simply a kind of data input that we receive and think about. That more the senses are a vehicle for our reasoning, a vehicle for our investigations. So perception is also a very intelligent activity. We are looking for something. When it's a case of gathering evidence. Yes, on the one hand, like the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who was excellent at gathering both the opinions of others, but also the material evidence. What is it that he was gathering? On the one hand, it's true, it is the opinions of others. When, for example, life begins, what is the soul? There can be all kinds of gathering of opinions. But on the other hand, there is also this active perception. If, for example, I'm working in the garden and I pick up lettuce seed, which is tiny, it's like the end of a needle, and you use a little stick that you might put marshmallows on over a fire in order to roast the marshmallows. Well, you can use this very slender stick to pick up one lettuce seed at a time, as opposed to a potato, which is a much greater kind of seed as it starts to sprout. Now, these simple observations do actually lead into what is a beginning. And so, rather than just considering sort of abstract terms, to look at a seed like a lettuce seed and to see it sprout, you're not looking at something that goes through transitions in an arbitrary way, but actually very quickly takes a stem and little leaves, and so very quickly is manifesting what it is. Now, one of the great problems, you could say, in understanding the human person and the origin of personhood is this difficulty that people have with imagining that there can be a seed from which, through the coming together of the husband and wife and a mysterious action of God which brings the soul to exist at the same time, that from this seed there can emerge the human person, not as something subsequent to the moment of fertilization, but as an unfolding of it. Now, this seems so difficult for us to visualize, but when actually we are looking at plants and how they grow, there is this remarkable significance. On the one hand, you have a seed that, when planted and moistened, doesn't go through changes which are other than what it's going to be, but rather goes through changes that manifest what it is. And that's precisely the way one kind of investigation can help and unfold another. Because while it's so much more difficult for us to grasp because of its hidden nature, although there are now photographs showing the early development of the human person, in the case of a very simple illustration, to see how a seed changes makes it very clear in a way, in a very simple way. And again, it comes back to this reason handling something to help us understand. And St. Thomas Aquinas would say, when we're pondering spiritual realities, we need to have recourse to a concrete image or expression. And so in a certain way, it's natural for us to take something that is more familiar, that is around us, to help us consider, what is the nature of conception? What is the nature of a beginning? And from the considerations that emerge, it seems far more logical, if you like, far more characteristic of how a beginning takes place, that there is not a series of stages, as Aristotle once thought, a plant stage, an animal stage, and the stage of the rational ensoulment of a human being. Rather, there is, in its simplicity, an unfolding from a single point of departure, namely conception itself. Because actually, when we consider other beginnings, when we consider the beginning of a plant, when we consider the beginning of a lettuce seed, the beginning of a potato, we see there is something that exists. And that, and it's from that beginning of what exists that there then unfolds not something else, but what that species is. And while it seems very obvious, it isn't. I think it's necessary for people to consider these very obvious points of departure, because there are many misconceptions around the beginning of the human person, as if it's some kind of bubbling of cells, some kind of incoherent or chaotic point of departure. But when we consider beginnings, they're far from chaotic, they're far from arbitrary or incoherent. What we see is this inert start. And that's one of the things that struck me recently as I was planting these lettuce seeds, that this seed is inert and something starts it. And in a discussion with a person with a very much more scientific background to myself in the sense of the sciences, he said, where there is life, there is electrical impulses. So, on the one hand, we have this inert seed planted in moist soil, the moisture being significant because it's a conductor of electricity. And what we find is that this moist seed takes a start. It begins. And there is this extraordinary parallel, because on the one hand we have the seed and how it develops once it's in the moist soil, but then also there is this inertia in the ovum. Prior to fertilization by the male sperm, the ovum is inert. It has this characteristic readiness. Now, there seems to be almost a likeness between the inert lettuce seed and the ovum, the egg, because the ovum or the egg is inert. The mitochondrial activity is nil. But on fertilization, it rapidly develops, multiplies, goes through all kinds of stages and processes of development. Similarly, the lettuce seed, as it's moistened, so it starts to spring into life. So there is something very simple to help us in the world around us in all kinds of ways. But this fundamental one of analogies between different events, different kinds of beginning, again plays into this characteristic of the universe as a whole, that it can convey meanings in multiple ways. And this itself speaks of the coherence of what exists as, we would say, as created. And one of the great advantages of looking at the universe from the point of view of it being created is it gives one more a sense of the wholeness of what exists. If we take a more ancient idea, namely that matter has always existed, you then introduce, in a Platonic sense, a form that then changes that matter into something specific. So there would be the Platonic form of the horse that would then transform that matter into the horse. And at the same time, it's some kind of eternal existence. So, on the one hand, it has a resonance we could say, between an idea in God that then takes form in a particular creature. But then also we have this kind of dichotomy between matter that's always existing and then a form that comes out of eternity, as it were, to change it, to make it something. Now, in a way, that's also in Aristotle, because I think Aristotle also held the view that matter was eternal. But in his case, there was a much more intimate connection between what we call the form or the soul of a living creature and the matter. They entered into each other in a much more intimate way, such that in the language that was taken up in philosophy, it can be said that form and matter constitute one substance. They're not two substances joined, as it were. The one is intimately interconnected with the other, so that we're expressing one substance, one human person, one plant, one animal. But at the same time, even Aristotle has this limitation of there being matter which is then informed. So there isn't, if you like, a fundamental unity. And so one of the things that arises when going back to, looking at these seeds and watching them grow, or looking at a potato and seeing it sprout before it's then cut up so that those sprouts can grow into the plant, and the plant into producing the potatoes, which incidentally grow out of the roots on a placenta-like tube. I mean, extraordinary, really, that you have this potato plant, and it has these long tubes that come out of the bottom of the plant, and at the end of which you then get the formation of the potato, small or large according to how it's grown. And so you have these characteristics and a variety of ways of growing, but at the same time you have this sense of the wholeness of each entity, the wholeness of the lettuce plant, the wholeness of the potato. And in that sense, it almost seems more credible that behind all that exists, or expressed in everything that exists, is a wholeness in the conception of it. If you consider a person who's designing a sculpture, like we were considering Rodin, in a sense, that thinker is an expression of a whole idea of the artist, as it's embodied in the material. For all the fact that there is a process shaping the matter, Aristotle would call the variety of causes there, one of which would be the kind of material and its impact on the design. Another is the end goal. Another is the instrument by which the object is shaped, instrumental cause. But at the same time, all these things come together to produce one artifact, the thinker. And in many ways, although this takes place through time, what we actually are recognizing is that the goal of the artist, the goal of the sculpture, is one thing, is the thinker. And it makes so much more sense then to consider the plant. When I look at it, it doesn't go through unrecognizable changes. On the contrary, it, as soon as it can, expresses what it is. Now, clearly, there are incredibly subtle changes that go on in the soil and are scarcely visible to the ordinary eye. But at the same time, they're there, and they take place, and they show themselves in the first shoot that arises out of the soil, sometimes even with the kind of seed shell being carried by the plant as it grows out of the soil. And you have then this sense of the object as a whole. And clearly, because it's growing out of the soil, you've got not just the fact that the plant is there and the plant is growing, but the whole sense of it in its ecological environment, receiving the moistness in the soil itself and all its characteristics, whether it's got manure in or whether it's got rotted vegetables in that are broken down in a compost, whether it's got soil from the ground, whether it's got compost that's come from a cultivated source, and the whole thing mixed in. You have all these elements to the growth of the seed. It doesn't just accidentally grow. It grows in an environment that suits it, that brings out what it is. And so in many ways, actually putting one's hands in the dirt, as it were, pulling up weeds, looking closely at plants as they develop, it's possible to notice all kinds of things which go in all kinds of directions. And I think this returning philosophy back to its source through this original meaning of reason, to turn things through the hands as part of thinking through what they are, is very important. And not only that, returning to the kind of fact that we are, according to St. John Paul II, we are all called to be philosophers. We are all naturally philosophical. We are all capable of thinking through what we see, understanding what it is, whether it involves research or conversation or in whatever way we've investigated what is around us, what we are. And so we are also unfolding what it is to be a person engaged in the realities or the reality in which we live. And that brings out this sense to which I'm returning of reason not being disembodied, of it expressing our interest. Aristotle himself said, philosophy begins in wonder. We look at something and we wonder. In St. John Paul II's work on philosophy, his work on faith and reason, he speaks of the wonder that something exists at all. Why does it exist as opposed to there being nothing? Why is there something as opposed to there being nothing? And we can engage in a very concrete way and see almost literally that our sight is not simply a kind of function of light passing through the lens and stimulating the cells in the eye and then through the optic nerve into the brain. As if in some sense there's a kind of passive receptivity to all that goes on, which there is I mean, insofar as we see colours and we see shapes, these things aren't our invention. This is what the draftsman does, in drawing, or this is what the engineer does in making use of materials. But at the same time, our perceptive powers, as it were, are active. As much as we are in receiving or in receipt of the input of the senses, we are certainly going out in our search for what it is that is in front of us. Whether it's understanding the growth of a plant or whether it's admiring the colours of a rose or a sunset, we are going out through the very handling and sensing of what it is we're doing, just as much, in a sense, if not more, than we're just passively receiving the information, if it can be called that, through our senses. So it's this much more enriched or enriching account that is a constant task, really, for recovering philosophy and the philosopher as a wholesome activity, as what emerges out of our experience and engages us in the world around us. Does that make sense?
Boy, I'll say it does. I've got to tell you, you're a much deeper thinker than me. I am just fascinated. When you're talking about, why is there something rather than nothing, which in itself is interesting, and then, that's really something we really need to consider. And I love how you describe how God had this whole awareness, I guess we would say, of creation and the different parts, right down to the little atomic elements and things. It's fascinating when you consider it that way. It's like, when we think of the creation story where God creates this, then he creates that, in these sort of discrete acts, and yet, and ends up with a whole. It's like this gives, what you're talking about gives a much clearer understanding of what it means to say creation, because he knew how everything, and I mean we knew that, but it's the way you put it, that everything was planned all in an instant, so to speak, and just goes through time and space. It's really fantastic. You're definitely a deep thinker.
Well, there is a certain sense in which there's no such thing as a bare fact. If we consider, the very things you name there, like particles, there's a certain capability in what exists that it can be named. And there is a lovely brief account of this in Genesis. Adam, while on his own, names what exists and discovers both who he is and how he is different from the plants and the animals. But actually, when we consider what exists, there is a kind of intimate marriage between an object like a person, or perhaps we take something simpler, like a chair. That it has a design as a whole, it's material, but then we can also name it more intimately, you might say, speaking about the grain of the wood. And the grain of the wood tells us about its growth. If there's a knot in the wood, it tells us that there was a branch coming out at that particular part in the branch or trunk, depending where the wood is cut from. There is a sense in which the world, reality, is susceptible to perception in such a way it can be named more and more intimately, right down, as you say, to the particles. And even the particles are innumerable. And some of them have these extraordinary names like quark or strange, or more familiar ones perhaps are proton, neutron and electron and their spins and how they interact. Now, this sense of the universe being accessible to our intelligence, and not just accessible but identifiable, sort of allows us to always to go further. But at the same time, we can also draw back and see, well, actually, nothing exists, but that it can be expressed in, I always want to say, innumerable details. On the one hand, you have the wholeness of an object, whether it's a chair that we've made, or whether it's a plant that exists like a rose. Now, on the one hand, you have some incredible geometric shapes. You have, almost identical left and right sides of a leaf, or, wonderful curves and circles in the unfolding of the rose itself. But at the same time, in the very naming of a plant, in the very perceiving of it, there always seems to be something further to see, something more to be disclosed. And in that sense, when we're looking at reality, we're not looking at a bare substance, as it were. Much as the language makes sense to say that substance identifies the identity of an object, and the accidents refer to what is changeable. At the same time, the accidents, as in the colour, the shape, the texture, are transparent to what the object is. So the potato is pale, is hard and solid, certainly before it begins to decompose. But it's not as if we're looking at something other than. So the accidents, the shape, colour, the surface nodules are transparent to what it is, that it is a potato, that it does have shoots, that it does grow into a plant. So the reality that exists is so incredibly susceptible to observation, to intelligent differentiation, the naming of different parts. And so, again, looking at reality, we're looking at something which is itself incredibly enriched, so that we can almost, in a way like an onion, unpeel this richness, but at the same time retain the fact that it is an onion, and it does have layers which belong together, and indeed an outer skin that surrounds it, which isn't at all tasty, and we peel it as we open the onion and cut it up for cooking. So all the things or objects or living things that exist have this penetrability, we could say, that suggests that their making cannot be arbitrary, nor can our relationship, our capacity to enter into what they are, be arbitrary. The very fact that this dialogue exists between us, and I'm not even talking about between two people, but in the sense of a dialogue with what exists, it always invites further investigations, whether we're actually going to Mars via a satellite, or whether we're using an electron microscope to get into the minutiae of some extraordinary creatures. I mean, I remember seeing a picture of a flea which had a flea on it. I mean, it was, on the one hand, itself incredibly small, but then also, with the magnification of this electron microscope, there was what looked like a flea on the leg of the flea. And this is something that even with magnification, we don't lose identity of what it is we're looking at. On the contrary, it seems to bring out more and more of what actually exists, what actually ordinarily is invisible, but is present. And so this sense of reality being like a gift that is openable, approached in the right way, so that we perhaps need to be more contemplative, so that we're not just analyzing in the sense of taking apart, but also being willing to reconsider the whole from which we began. So that there's always this going into detail, into analysis, but at the same time also this return to the whole object, and not just to the whole object, but to our dialogue with it, its sense of being a present, given, you could say, in the very giving of creation. The whole thing has this characteristic of gift, of being a present that actually is openable, but openable, in a way that brings it out its goodness, that we're not just smashing something in order to get the juice out of it, but rather opening it perhaps more gently, more in an understanding way, so that a bit like how the world around us has, on the one hand, been exploited, and resources have been sort of drawn to the point of, if not extinction, exhaustion, as it were, as opposed to cultivating, drawing less on something in order to let it grow back, perhaps thinking more of a school of fish, not taking them all, but leaving those to reproduce and to grow. And again, not just for the sake of food, but, in these marvellous programs which show us the extraordinary delights of fish around the coral reef, or, the shapes of these creatures, sponges, or, fish with tendrils, or the most extraordinary shapes and colours. And you think to yourself, this is a work of the imagination. It's not just that these things exist because of the conditions under which they live, because there is such variety. And how does that variety originate? Like the variety of painters, or like the variety of musicians. In a sense, it originates from the characteristics of the artist. Whether that artist is Van Gogh, or Cézanne, or an impressionist. Now, in the same way, the variety of what exists seems to have more to do, in a way, with the testament or the witness to the imagination of a creator than it does to the sheer, if you like, calculable varieties of different ingredients of that go to make up a creature. The variety of design seems to be so fantastically rich and so integral you have a creature that is a whole, but in being a whole is also different while similar to, the varieties of crab or the varieties of spider or the varieties of fish. This sense of the multiplicity of species seems to me to speak much more of the creativity, of the imagination of God. Just as, a craftsman or a painter throughout his life, like Mondrian, for example, he started with trees and he went on to, over a long period of time, to see the trees more and more simply and the light coming through the branches to the point where he ended up with grids, coloured grids. Now, in one sense, you can see a development of the artist. In another sense, you can see the variety of his expressions. And I think it's equally true with what exists. On the one hand, we can see the development, the unfolding from a seed, from an idea of what something is, whether it's a lettuce or a potato. But on the other hand, we can see variety, and that variety seems to be as much a characteristic of what exists as the process of development, so that one doesn't simply supplant another, that actually variety is a fundamental of the reality that we live in, that the world exists. Just as we as artists or writers will produce a variety of work, variety does seem to be something very basic. We could almost say that creation has this capacity to draw us into in such a way as we can't exhaust its capacity to be named. It rather has this tendency to be inexhaustible. And so what we see is a multiplicity of sciences, a multiplicity of arts, a multiplicity of endeavors to both investigate the universe and to express in human culture what we find, whether it's directly related to the world around us or whether it's more remote in terms of abstractions. But either way, we have a sense of the inexhaustibility, that there's something about the nature of reality, that it doesn't just passively exist. It exists, in a sense, with this capacity to draw us out of ourselves. But in going into what exists, there seems to be almost an intimation of eternity in its inexhaustibility. No matter how small we get, there is something smaller. Speaking about the flea on the leg of the flea, there is still that small flea that can still be enlarged had we the microscope to do it. Or if we go to the scale of the universe, as far as we can go, there seems to be further to go. There is a characteristic of what exists as being its inexhaustibility. And one wonders, isn't this an intimation of the mystery of its very existence? That somehow the Creator has made present a mystery in the very existence of matter, in the very existence of the universe, that it has this inexhaustibility about it, almost a kind of intimation of the mystery of God himself.
Mm-hmm. It is really amazing when you think of how small things can get, and I bet that we haven't even discovered the level to which things can be smaller, all the way up to looking at the size of the universe. It really gives you such a sense of, God's creative power. truly amazing. So from the teeny tiniest little thing, which we probably don't even know what it is yet, all the way up to the size of the universe and all the diversity and the beauty. The diversity is really beautiful. So,
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Almost in the composition of the human person. What we find is everything takes on, if you like, a personal expression. We are no less matter than anything else that exists. But the matter that we are is subsumed under this capacity to express the person, to make present the fact that we aren't just beings in isolation, but rather beings in relationship to one another, and indeed in relation to our Creator. So, the very flesh and bones and the properties of skin and the cells, everything about us is as material as it can be, but at the same time, the materiality of our personhood is making visible the fact that we are a person, literally. And that meaning, or that expression, person, according to St. Thomas, it is that which is the most perfect in existence. And in the first place, he's referring to God. Physicality that we possess, has all these characteristics of the universe in terms of, the detail that's possible to understand of the nervous system and the synapses and the intricacies in the cross currents in the brain between all the linkages between one part and another, and then the facial expressions, and then the hand movements. We are as physical as it's possible to be in one sense, but our physicality has this unique capacity of making present the person. So in one sense, yes, we can look at reality in its almost its unreachable depth, but at the same time, we give a face to it. And in that sense, again, we come back to the possibility of a Creator who is personal, because on the one hand, there is an unreachability in terms of the depths and detail of what exists. But on the other hand, there is the fact that we are made of so many elements of what exists, but at the same time, we manifest the person. And the person, according to St. Thomas, is that which is most perfect in existence. Now, in the first place, he's referring to God, but actually in the work of St. John Paul II, he takes up this language of the person and really explores it. And one of the background ideas, which actually I recall more from the work of Cardinal Ratzinger, is one on St. Augustine, is person expresses relationship. If we think of the three persons in one God, person is also relation. The Father is both the Father of the Son and the origin of the Holy Spirit with the Son. Each of the divine persons is a relationship to the other. And so relationship is really fundamental to us in our individuality. And so our personhood that is made visible in our flesh is at the same time a person that is capable and indeed exists in relationships. The very fact that we're conceived through our parents means that our very existence originates out of the relationship of our parents. It originates out of the act of God, which is at the very foundation of our existence. So we are beings for relationship. And so, in the dialogue with creation, it is a relationship we're expressing. The very unreachability of getting to the end of the universe, draws us into this relationship with it, of seeking, well, why is it the way it is? Why is it so inexhaustible? And at the same time, we give a face, because this is also the other echo of the Creator, that we give a face to what exists, that materiality has a face. It's called a person, man and woman. So, perhaps it's time to draw this to a close.
Well, I found this to be fascinating, especially when you consider there's another 2 books to follow in the same trilogy. So, it's I really like this. It's just such a richer way, a fuller way of thinking about creation, as opposed to these discrete little objects or discrete types of objects. It's a very different way of looking at creation. It's beautiful. The way of looking at it is beautiful.
So, would you like to conclude with a prayer then, Cynthia?
Certainly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Are you praying, or am I?
No, I think it's your turn.
Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee.
The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.